Welcome back to Recharging the Human Battery here on AM 950 Radio. Dr. Sinacropi is out today, so you've got me, Mandi Dickey, nurse practitioner extraordinaire, as he always calls me, the brain side of this duo here on the radio. So again, as I do often when I'm here alone, I've got another letter of the alphabet for my TBI takeover in the ABCs of concussion. So last time I was here, we covered letters J and K, which kind of hinted towards some of the things I'll talk about today in letter L. So as we go through, again, just a brief reminder on why I do these letters of the episode as we're talking about recharging the human battery throughout the whole thing. Our brain is a big user of calories in our body. It uses about 20% of all the energy that we take in. So it is a big part of the energy expenditure in our body. So that's why I like to cover it. Plus, I'm just a big brain geek. So why do we do this ABCs of concussion? Because probably about half of all people walking around in the United States right now have had a head injury to some degree at some point in their lives. You may or may not know. It may or may not have been diagnosed, and maybe you didn't really identify what was going on at the time, but you develop problems later on. You don't have to have symptoms immediately upon getting a head injury. And as we've talked about multiple times on the show here, you don't have to hit your head to get a head injury. Just the inertia of your brain moving back and forth inside of your skull can cause brain damage, and we see that in all of the different symptoms that we've been talking about throughout this whole series of the ABCs of concussion. Again, these may be symptoms that you have experienced after a head injury, or someone that you love has experienced after a head injury, or maybe you have these symptoms and you didn't know why. So then I would encourage you again to go back and look and see what happened prior to these symptoms starting. Was there potentially an injury or an accident or something that happened that may have resulted in a head injury and you just didn't get diagnosed? Because as I tell my patients all the time, we historically have not been really good at diagnosing head injuries, and sometimes we still aren't. People will come in and we might be distracted by the other injuries that occur during a trauma. So if you're in a motor vehicle accident and you have a fractured arm, leg, whatever, that gets the attention because we can see it on imaging. We see that there's an injury there, and we focus on that injury. And that tends to be the idea of focus until it's healed. And then at that point, that might be when you realize that you have symptoms of a head injury that really weren't addressed prior to this point, because that broken area was the area of focus. So sometimes it takes a little bit of time to identify that you've had a head injury. So again, that's the why behind all of these ABCs of concussion. Not the letter Y, that's down the road, but that's the why of why I'm covering it and why it's such a big deal to talk about. So half of everybody walking around has had a brain injury to some degree. And we now know that about a third of all people that have a head injury go on to have symptoms well beyond a year. So anything that's covered in these might be something that will relate to somebody who's had a head injury or a family member. So again, if you are the injured person, the caregiver, the loved one, whatever you may be, great series for you to listen to. So if you haven't been listening to previous episodes, go back and look. We've got it all on the website. You can catch up on the ABCs of concussion there. But today we've got letter L. So all of the things today, again, we'll start with that letter L. The first one I'll kind of tease you with a little bit before we go on to the break. The first topic is legal issues. And this is the one that kind of hinted at last episode when we talked about J with the justice, whole topic there. But the legal issues can be directly from the injury, or they can be as a consequence related to the symptoms that somebody is experiencing after a brain injury. So a couple different reasons why we're going to talk about those legal issues today in regards to a brain injury. But we will get that into way more in depth when we come back on the other side of the break here on AM 950 Radio. Again, recharging the human battery. Mandi Dickey. We'll see you on the other side. Back from from that break. Again, we are on AM 950 radio. This is Recharging the Human Battery. Again, I am Mandi Dickey. Dr. Synecropy is out today, so you've got me, the nurse practitioner, that likes to focus on the brain. And being Halloween season, it's perfect time to talk about brains, right? So again, before the break, I was talking about how we are doing letter L today for the ABCs of concussion. In my TBI takeover week here again. So letter L, the first topic is legal issues, as I was kind of alluding to before the break. So legal issues when somebody has a brain injury can be directly related to the injury itself, such as a personal injury claim. So if you're in a car accident, you have a personal injury claim, you get a personal injury lawyer. These are the things that you'll be dealing with for the legal issues from that car accident. Or it can be a consequence. Because of all of the changes in personality and the symptoms we've talked about with brain injury, when somebody has changes in their impulsivity and they can't really tell right from wrong, they end up doing some dangerous behavior that can get them involved in the legal system that way. When we have somebody that has changes in their personality that leads to infidelity in the relationship or lying in the relationship, marriages may end in divorce. Again, you end up down the legal system from that perspective. And it can also lead to the justice system, the legal system, if you do things that break the law. So again, consequences of those changes in personality, those changes related to the brain injury itself. There are several different types of legal claims that you can see being taken on because of the brain injury. And again, I briefly kind of covered these back in that letter J episode for justice, but there was a whole lot more that I was able to identify as needs to talk about to cover. So this will go way more in depth than we did in that last conversation. The first type of claim would be a personal injury claim, as I kind of already mentioned. This is the most common when somebody believes that the other party that was involved was negligent. So that negligent party's actions, such as a car accident, a slip and fall if you slip on somebody else's property or public property, for example, a sports injury, something that the other person did or didn't do led to that injury that led to the concussion. That's when you get that personal injury case involved. Product liability is something that's probably less common, but it can be there. It's related to some sort of defective product that can be blamed as the cause for the concussion. So maybe a seatbelt didn't actually latch. Something went wrong with a product that was supposed to protect you and it didn't protect you. Or maybe it wasn't supposed to cause a head injury at all, but the product exploded or did something to cause a head injury, and then you can put fault on that and go after the product creator. A premises liability claim means that there was unsafe conditions on someone else's property that led to your concussion. So going to a place of business, to someone else's home, and we are coming up on winter season here soon. Before we know it, we're going to have snow on the ground, and we all have to be really careful that we shovel our sidewalks. We keep them free of ice, because if somebody falls on that, you could be liable for this premises liability claim if somebody were to get injured on your property, whether it's private property or business property. And then in the case of some sports organizations, there might be a class act lawsuit if it's based on the sports organization not following the standard of care for concussion prevention or for concussion management. And there are several cases to demonstrate this. So the NFL back in 2014 and the NCAA back in 2016 both had cases that led to highlighting the dangers of multiple concussions and negligence, meaning they weren't paying attention to these concussions. So both of those class action lawsuits identified the need for improved care. So I think that has what led to a lot of the changes in sports since that time, because people are actually taking more concern and more interest in it. The Illinois High School Association attempted to have the same kind of suit for legislative changes in the state's concussion policies. It was ultimately dismissed, but that action alone, just trying to file for this, opened the door for possible other cases in the future. And that was the first of its kind going for a high school level and just the state level in general. So it's definitely gaining more traction, gaining more attention. And when we get cases like that, it is really to increase education, to increase improve the policies that we have in place so that our young students aren't having more injuries. And then from the different types of cases, there are several different damages that you can seek. One would be quantifiable losses. Quantifiable means we can actually put a number, a dollar amount on it, for example. And the important thing here is that you look at past, present, and future medical bills and therapies. So if somebody is in this case, we're looking at everything from the injury moving forward. And it's really important to kind of take into account what can happen during these different times, because if you settle too soon, you might not know the full extent of somebody's injuries, and you might settle for less than what would actually be helpful for you moving forward. So past, present, future. Past not meaning before the injury occurred, but as this legal case goes on, the injury itself becomes the past. So the past, the present, the future, looking at all of those medical bills and all therapies that might be necessary. The lost wages and future earning capacity of this. Because again, if you can't get back to your normal job, you can't get back to the hours that you were working before, that leads to financial difficulties for you and your family. So making sure that you take into account what you've lost so far, and additionally, what you might lose moving forward if you're not back to that same status that you were at prior to your injury. And then also the last part of that quantifiable losses would be any caregivers that you might need, any respite care, any home modifications that might be necessary because of somebody's injury level. So whether the person is now in a wheelchair and you have to modify the home to be wheelchair accessible, or any of the things that go along with that. And again, any caregivers that are needed if you have home care, home nurses coming in, somebody helping out with the injured person. All of that can be part of that quantifiable losses. You can put an amount on it. The part that's a little bit more difficult, but you can still get compensation for, is the intangible harms, the things that we can't quantify. Pain and suffering, emotional distress, and as we've talked about with some of these different letters in the alphabet, loss of enjoyment of life and the impact on personal relationships, because we all know from everything that we've talked about during these ABCs, those relationships change. People might not have the same friendships that they did prior to their injury coming out the other end of it, because friends don't understand, public doesn't understand, social events don't understand the changes that you've had because of your brain injury. So they're harder to put a dollar amount on, but it is important to take those things into consideration when you are building a case. There are several challenges related to trying to do a brain injury case, for whether it's personal injury, any of the above. The first being proof of that injury. Because brain injury doesn't tend to show up on standard imaging, it can be difficult to prove that somebody has an actual brain injury. Probably 99% of the time when you get a head image, whether it's a CT or an MRI, it will be negative or normal, saying that there's nothing acutely showing up on that image. And the things that we're looking for those acute changes would be bleeding onto the brain or a fracture, whether it's a skull fracture, facial fracture, jaw fracture, something related to that trauma. That only shows up in about 1% of the cases. The rest of these patients, because there are so many people that have head injury, again, that's where I come up with that approximate 99%, will have normal imaging. That does not mean that there was no brain injury that happened. It just means you didn't have a fracture or you didn't have blood onto your brain. That's the only thing that negative image means. So the proof of injury becomes very difficult. There is another type of image that can show that you've had brain injury, but it's not a popular type yet. So the Amen clinics across the United States have this scan called a SPECT scan, S-P-E-C-T. It is a 3D rendering of the brain, so you can see the actual changes that occur when somebody has a brain injury. It's not standard. It's not something that everybody gets. It's not in every state, so sometimes people have to travel to get there. Traveling can be difficult depending on your level of injury, so it's not something that's going to happen all the time. I have had a few patients that I have referred down there, especially if they have legal cases going on, because we can get that proof that they've had a brain injury. So there is that, but for most people, it's not going to be there. The other part that becomes a challenge is that Symptoms of a head injury can be very vague. They include things like headaches, memory issues, cognitive changes, so problems with your memory, problems with your thinking, your concentration, things like that. All of those can lead to skepticism about the validity of there being a brain injury. And I have seen this on IME cases that have come in for people that have legal cases going on for work injury, for example. And they are told then that they either don't have a head injury, or that if they did have a head injury, it was considered a mild brain injury and they should be fine by now. So those vague symptoms are the problems getting back to work, unfortunately, because if you have a headache that's a 9 out of 10 headache, 24 hours a day, it's really difficult to focus on anything else, and it's difficult to get back to work. The problem being is that it's a very subjective number. So we can't test somebody and say, yes, you're having a 9 out of 10 headache, because 9 out of 10 headache for one person might not be the same as a 9 out of 10 headache for another person. And that's where that difficulty comes in, because a lot of these symptoms are subjective, that it does make people wonder, do you really have these symptoms? And having them myself for over 2 years now, I can tell you, yes, they really happen. So it's a problem trying to get people to understand that those symptoms are still there, and it can sometimes be a problem getting people to realize that these are related to the head injury. So sometimes you have to prove that you didn't have those issues prior to your injury, and you do now. So then we have to say that it's more likely than not related to the injury, because we can never say with 100% certainty. But I can say pretty certain that if somebody didn't have symptoms and then they had an injury and now they do have symptoms, that it's probably related. The other part is legal capacity. And this can be a challenge for the more severe cases. So when somebody had a really severe brain injury and they no longer have that decision-making capacity because their memory span is so short, they can't remember things from 1 second to the next. They can't really remember where they are, what day it is, much less remember the details of their injury. So because that can happen, they might require a court-appointed legal guardian so that that person can help with all the details. So that legal capacity does come into play when you're trying to make these cases for a legal case for the injury. So you need to have that person that can speak on your behalf. And then when you're building a case for this, again, with all of those other things in mind, medical documentation is really important. So documentation of the concussion, of the impact of the concussion, document is all I can say on that one. When we're looking at the symptoms that you're experiencing, at one point after my own injury, I started keeping track of everything on a spreadsheet. So I made my little spreadsheet and documented all of my appointments, what came from those appointments, if I had any referrals from anything else, and how I felt from day to day. So if I had days that I felt really okay, if I had days that I felt really bad, if I noticed that I could do something that I couldn't do before, that all went on that spreadsheet. Partly because I couldn't remember it from day to day. So as much as I could, I tried to document at the end of every day so that I knew what was going on at any given time. Because if I missed a day, that day was probably gone in my notes. I couldn't go back and try to remember it. But it was really helpful for me, but it was also really helpful for everybody else around me. I didn't do a legal case for mine. However, but if I would have had all that documentation there. It was also really good for that documentation just for communicating with my spouse. My husband couldn't go to all my appointments. He was still going to work. So he wasn't at my appointments, so it was hard to keep him updated on everything. So once I started this spreadsheet, it was really good for communication for us too. So again, it's not just for the legal case, it's for so many other reasons, but having all that documentation in one place is a really, really helpful thing for building a case with your family or building a legal case. So that's a lot on that one. But with all of that medical documentation, the nice thing about us being on electronic medical records now is that you can pull up all those notes. So you can sign into your account, you can pull up all those notes, print them all, have them all on hand, whether it be therapy notes or your medical appointments. Any of those, all really important to have. I've had some patients come into my office and they have a 3-ring binder and everything is color-coded and stamped and we can see time frames and where they're at. It's people after my own heart with that one, because I love when you can organize and keep everything controlled and all together like that, because it just makes that case a little bit easier. Expert testimony is really important when you're building a case also. Medical experts that are in that field can provide testimony on the symptoms, duration, the effects on life. And it's really important to have those experts, because those working in the legal field they're not experts on everything in medicine. That's not their area of expertise. So having people that are considered medical experts in those areas are really helpful to have, so that they can say, yes, this is an issue. Yes, this is seen quite often. They can refer back to the research and really help to support your case. And then again, legal representation, really important with all of this, because as a person with a brain injury, it's difficult to do all of this on your own. Having that legal representation is really, really important. So you want to make sure that you have somebody that's experienced in brain injury that can help you gather that evidence, connect everything to the at-fault party's actions if it's a personal injury case, and then that pursue either the settlement or the lawsuit. I think I mentioned this in the justice one, but if not, the Brain Injury Association of America does have a website for this purpose. So they list off some of the preferred attorneys that have experience in each state. So you can look up your state, look for somebody that has experience with brain injury and start there. Doesn't mean you have to work with one of those people, but it's a really good place to start so that you know you're getting somebody who has experience with brain injury. They know the kind of the details that are necessary, and they can help you follow along that train of path there. So that's a lot of information about that legal case. Can be really, really important. And for some people, that can kind of help close the door, because once you have gotten through that whole case, that allows you to move on and go to the next steps in your life. The next L letter then is loneliness. And this one, again, I've kind of touched on in previous letters as well. A lot of it related to relationship changes. But loneliness in general, when we're talking about somebody that has a brain injury, can come from multiple different reasons. Physical, cognitive, and emotional changes all can lead to social isolation and loss of that common ground that you had previously with your friends and family. So it makes it very awkward sometimes going out to try to get together with friends, and you don't have those same things to talk about. You're not going to work. You're not going on with your day-to-day activities as normal, whereas they're all talking about work and things that are going on. And especially if it's friends that you work with, you can't really contribute to that conversation anymore. So sometimes, if you've ever heard the term of feeling lonely even when you're surrounded by all sorts of other people, that can be the case when you don't have that common ground to talk about anymore. And then, as we've previously discussed, some relationships don't last through the recovery from a brain injury because things change, because your personality changes. And I've heard this from many, many patients that have come in, and they no longer have the same friends or the same friend groups after their brain injury as they did beforehand. And it does lead to a lot of loneliness. And as we age, our friendships in general tend to be connected to proximity. So when we're not close to someone, it might make it difficult to stay close in that relationship because other things happen in our life. And sometimes those relationships naturally dwindle because of lack of proximity. But this can be a very daunting thing for somebody in the wake of a brain injury. So when you're trying to recover from the brain injury and these natural progressions of friendships happen, it doesn't feel natural at that time. Individuals that have the brain injury can feel judged, as we talked about with judgment last time, whether it's actually happening or not. And then because of that, they tend to be less social and isolate themselves a little bit more. Changes with language abilities, such as word finding, comprehension, the ability to follow the conversations and hear others appropriately, all of those make social situations embarrassing and overwhelming, and again, leads to people not wanting to have these engagements. Auditory processing disorder, I think we have briefly talked about this before as well, leads to difficulty understanding things in busy situations and crowds. So when you're trying to have a conversation in a restaurant or in a group of people, it makes it difficult to understand what the other person is saying and try to tune out some of those extra noises. So that social situation becomes overwhelming and uncomfortable, and people try not to do it because it doesn't feel good. And then just because other people are going on with their lives, doing their normal things, while that injured individual has had everything put on hold, also makes it difficult to try to continue with some of those social situations, leading again to isolation. And then the last part that can lead to some of that isolation is the fear of burdening others. And I hear this time and time again from my patients, is they don't want to be a burden on their friends or their family or anybody else. So you don't think that the other person wants to hear about your injury because all you talk about are your medical appointments or problems that you have in your life. So worrying about what the other person thinks about what you're talking about makes you not want to do it. So a lot of reasons why people might feel isolated or lonely after a brain injury. So how do we manage all of these things? Number one is seeking support, whether it's a healthcare provider, a support group, a counselor, or that trusted friend or relative that you do feel like you can talk to. It's really important to have that. And I have given the information for support groups to many patients because of this, because they need to be around somebody that does understand what they're going through. And then try to stay connected. So with those friends and family, try for a quieter setting or a smaller group. Rather than going out to a club where you may have gone with your friends before, maybe you get together and play cards at somebody's house. Do something that's a little quieter, a little less intimidating, a little less overwhelming. And then you can still be with your friends in a different setting. And then sometimes you do need to find a new routine or a new purpose. So finding activities and goals that provide that same sense of accomplishment that you had before, but in a different way. That was one of the things that I had to do when I changed my focus of my work a little bit. So I used to work in the hospital, mostly with stroke patients. And then after the injury, I'm in the clinic working all in brain injury. But by doing that, I still focused on things that made me feel important, made me feel needed, just in a different way. So finding that new routine and purpose can be a very helpful thing. Sometimes you don't feel like you're at that place where you can do that yet, but that's something to have as a goal. And then finding some low impact activities. Getting outside, getting fresh air. That's number one. Outside has always been my happy place, but getting outside, getting that sunshine. Sunshine is our only natural form of vitamin D, and that vitamin D is really good for your mental health, for sleeping, for brain functioning, all of those things. So trying to get outside as much as possible, even if it's just sitting out in the yard, just getting out there, getting some sunshine. And then possibly volunteering in a quiet area can help you find purpose and do something socially as well. You can educate others. And that's a really, really important thing for somebody that has a brain injury to do, whether it's educating your family and friends or actually becoming involved in activities like the Minnesota Brain Injury Alliance, the Brain Injury Association of America, any of these other organizations, becoming an advocate with them or just on your own. You can help your friends and your family understand the effects of concussion and the challenges that you face so that if they experience it or somebody else they know experiences it, they can either ask you or help that other person via what you've taught them. And then focusing on self-acceptance. This is something that I talk to my patients about probably on a regular basis. There's a very fine line between mental health and neurology, and I have walked that line for many, many years working in this field. But this is always one of the hardest things to do. We're very accepting of other people, usually, but we're not very accepting of our own situations. So we are definitely more critical of ourselves than others are. But once you're able to focus on that acceptance piece, you don't have to like where you're at. You just have to accept it because there is nothing else except for what you have at the moment. So once you can accept that, then you can figure out how to move forward. And your brain will let you do that. Once I got to that acceptance piece in my own recovery, it was like a light switch flipped. And all of a sudden things were improving because I wasn't fighting it anymore. So that's a huge part of kind of going through all of this, accepting where you are and what your limitations are, because then you tend to be less likely to feel like you're burdening others. You're more accepting of where you are. So it all comes together so much better. But again, just to kind of wrap up, that loneliness is a big factor that people deal with brain injury. The next L then is loss of consciousness. We abbreviate this in the medical world as LOC. Loss of consciousness, we did talk about this previously, so I'm not going to go into it great in depth, but I did feel like it was a good thing to cover again. So loss of consciousness can be as brief as a few seconds, or it can be greater than 24 hours in some severe cases. It is not required to have loss of consciousness to have a concussion. And this is what I've mentioned several times, but again, only about 10% of people that end up having a concussion actually lose consciousness. The rest are awake. It doesn't necessarily mean you're going to remember every moment of the event because you're awake. It just means you didn't lose consciousness. You didn't black out. You didn't have a time when you were not awake. So sometimes people will still say that they blacked out, they passed out, they saw stars, they got their bell rung, they got a ding, they got knocked out. All of these are terms that can be synonymous with loss of consciousness. Not everybody really thinks about that as actually losing consciousness when you black out, but that is the definition of what that is. And then loss of consciousness, again, has historically been important in rating the severity of concussion. So we have these three levels, mild, moderate, severe, which we've always kind of put people into these categories for concussion. And mild traumatic brain injury and mild head injury would be consistent with a concussion. So mild TBI and concussion are the same thing. With those, there is no loss of consciousness. So these are the 90% of people that do not lose consciousness. 90% of those are mild TBIs. Mild TBI, again, no loss of consciousness. Loss of consciousness from a few seconds all the way up to 24 hours would be a moderate TBI. And then greater than 24 hours is that severe TBI category. Those terms, as I like to describe them a little bit, are really only helpful for the moment that the brain injury has occurred. So when you have that injury, diagnosing it as mild, moderate, severe helps you figure out that level at the moment, whether there was loss of consciousness, whether there was a bleed or a fracture in the skull. That's it. It does not help you figure out long-term consequences. So this summer, there was a group an international group that came together to propose a new categorization of brain injury. And so I'm hoping to see more and more come out of that so that we will stop using these mild, moderate, severe terms and call it a concussion with whatever symptoms it is that the person is experiencing, because that's going to be more realistic to looking at long-term consequences for these people. So since we've covered that one in previous episodes, I'm not going to go much more in depth onto that one. I just wanted to bring it up again because, it's an L. It is loss of consciousness, starts with an L. So here we are in the ABCs with the L. The next letter then in the ABCs with letter L is language. And language can be affected not just what we speak, what we talk about, but also written language. So this can be anything from mild word finding troubles all the way up to what we call aphasia, which is difficulty with word finding, reading, listening, any of those things. We usually use that term with strokes, but it also can apply to somebody with a traumatic brain injury or an acquired brain injury as well. Some people can understand written language better than verbal, or vice versa, so it doesn't have to be the entire language that's affected. And some people who are multilingual, people that speak more than one language to begin with, might have difficulty switching between the languages, whereas they didn't before. So it can affect language, again, on multiple different levels. Dysarthria, or slurred speech, can be present because of weakened muscles in the face. And again, so looking at different reasons why we have speech issues. Apraxia of speech is another fancy term that we use. Apraxia of speech is impaired coordination of the pathways in the brain that form our words. This can lead to difficulty with initiating or executing speech, meaning if you're in a conversation with somebody, you have trouble coming up with the word to start the sentence, or you have trouble just putting those whole sentences together. So coordinating those pathways to make sure that the words go together correctly. Cognitive linguistic deficits mean that you have problems with attention, memory, reasoning, executive function. Executive function is all of those things that we do on a day-to-day basis that makes us who we are, essentially. And that will indirectly impact communication, because if you can't remember things, if you can't pay attention, it is going to make a difference in trying to have a conversation with someone and understand what they're saying. And it does make it difficult for organizing your thoughts as well. So all of those things go together so that you can organize a sentence, organize a thought, follow a comprehend and follow a train of thought in a conversation, and be able to communicate effectively. Social communication issues can be, again, difficulty understanding social cues or engaging in conversation. So understanding when it's appropriate for you to speak in a conversation. Mental fatigue. Communication requires a lot of mental effort to be able to focus, to be able to come up with the right words to answer the questions that are coming up and be a part of that conversation appropriately. All of that can be very exhausting. And humor, as we've previously discussed, humor and sarcasm can be difficult. That's part of language and communication. So subtle nuances in conversations might be missed, and people might take things too literally. They might have issues in that conversation because they don't take things as a joke or as sarcasm. And again, it might be difficult to realize when it's their turn to talk in a conversation. So they might become overly talkative, or they might forget things that they want to say, so they interrupt people. And then headaches and fatigue can also affect our processing speed and concentration and our ability to organize thoughts. So if you have a headache or if you're tired, it might make that conversation a little bit more difficult toward the end of the day, whereas earlier in the day might be a little bit easier. And then again, symptoms tend to get worse when it's busy, if it's a loud situation, or when you're talking with more than one person at a time, such as sitting at a table with friends or at a dinner table, and then again at the end of the day. How do we manage all these different language issues? This is where referrals to speech-language pathology, a speech therapist, is really, really important. And I will admit that when I was working in the hospital, most of what I saw the speech therapist working with was actual speech difficulties in swallowing. But speech and language involves not just our speech, but also the written part. So this is a lot of cognitive rehabilitation. We're working on communication skills. We're working on memory, the ability to remember things, how to remember things, how to learn things. That is all working with that speech pathologist. And it's really, really important to get that in place if you have these language difficulties. It's also really important to do the exercises prescribed by said speech-language pathologist so that you can practice those things between appointments. And then communicate your needs to their family and friends. Again, keeping those people close and letting them know what you struggle with helps them to be more understanding of you. The next big topic is licenses. And this one is really important for people who work in professional settings, for example. The personal licenses aren't affected quite as much, but personal and professional licenses can be affected. There aren't really specific rules for suspension of someone's driver's license after a concussion, but people do need to know that there might be a little bit more liability risk if they are driving while they're impaired. And some people might not even realize that they are impaired, so that could be a problem in and of itself. But there are no specific rules for it. Where there are more specifics are when people have higher licenses than just that typical driving license. So a pilot's license does require a significant recovery period before somebody can get their medical certificate reissued and get them back behind the pilot seat. Somebody that has a commercial driving license also requires clearance from a medical examiner before they can resume their duties. And then somebody with a medical or healthcare license, such as a nurse practitioner, physician, psychologist, any of these people will require more mental and physical fitness to perform their duties to make sure that they're no longer in danger to patients. So in all these instances, professionals should not return to work until their acute symptoms have resolved, and their return should be gradual. It needs to be a gradual multi-step process monitored by another licensed healthcare provider, ideally with concussion management expertise, so that they can get back successfully. If you go back too quickly, it might not set you up for success in that. And then in general, licensing rules will vary by state and profession, so some roles have more stringent requirements than others. Got a couple more things that I'll talk about on this when we come back from the break here on AM 950 Radio on Recharging the Human Battery. one more time today on Recharging the Human Battery on AM 950 Radio. Again, Dr. Sinacropi is out. It's been me, Mandi Dickey, talking about the ABCs of concussion letter L today. And before the break, I left off on our licensure conversation. So just a last couple thoughts on that one. Again, professional licenses need to make sure that you are safe to return to work. You essentially, with any kind of license, you need to make sure you understand your employer's policies. Whether the injury was sustained at work or personal time might play a role in your job coverage. The ADA workplace accommodations are still in place right now under the Americans with Disabilities Act, and they might offer some protection for you. And employers do have to follow this as long as they're reasonable to accommodate these things. Might include extra time for completing your tasks, reduced workload, a distraction-free work environment, flexible schedule, reduced work hours, things like that might be necessary. So know your rules, know the policies in place, and work with your healthcare providers so that you can get back successfully. The next topic I want to talk about is long-term effects. And this one kind of affects everybody as we're thinking about those 30+% of people that go on to have persistent post-concussive symptoms well beyond a year. So those long-term effects, most often, they are cognitive difficulties, memory, attention, concentration, processing speed. Those and headaches tend to be the top two things that go on long-term for people. Sleep disturbance is another one. It can be hypersomnia, meaning sleeping too much, or insomnia, you can't get to sleep. Fatigue, even with minimal exertion, even with lots of sleep, mood changes, dizziness, nausea, sensitivity to light and sound, changes in taste, smell, and vision. We don't always think about those things, but our senses definitely can be involved. Difficulty with social interactions, as we just talked about, relationship issues, job performance, and then kind of the big hot button topic right now, increased risk of CTE, that chronic traumatic encephalopathy. For somebody that's had multiple head injuries, this can be a risk, and it's not something that we can diagnose while you are living. This is only something we can diagnose on autopsy. We can start to see some things that might hint toward that while somebody is alive, but it's kind of like Alzheimer's. We don't really identify it while you're living. We can guess, which, by the way, Alzheimer's or dementia can occur after multiple brain injuries as well. And then the risk of future brain injuries. Once you've had one, it's really easy to get another one. Yay, fun. So how do we manage these long-term effects? Rest, cognitive rehab. There are many supplements or medications that can help treat the symptoms. OT, PT, mental health therapy, lifestyle management. So those simple things that aren't easy to do, getting enough sleep, eating healthy, managing stress, all the things that we should be doing anyway, regardless of whether or not you have a head injury. And then the very last thing to talk about is likes and dislikes. So when we talk about likes and dislikes, this is kind of an outcome of our personality changes. So when our personality shifts happen, it might actually change the things that you like and that you don't like. Physical changes might make the hobbies or interests that you used to really like, make them undesirable, or the chemical changes in your brain can make you not like the things that you used to do. And that can come as a shock to some people where they want to get back into those same activities that they used to do, but they just don't have the same enjoyment. So some people do actually develop new interests and hobbies that they didn't enjoy personally or previously before, or they didn't know that they would like them. So by those changes in chemical or physical changes, whatever it might be, that led you to not be able to enjoy those hobbies anymore, that might force you to find something new. Phobias and fears may change. Those things may diminish, or you may create new fears. You can have changes in food cravings and preferences. And your frontal lobe, the front part of your brain, affects your personality and your emotion. So some people feel like they are a whole new person with new likes and dislikes. I like to call myself Mandi 2.0 because of my brain injury changes. Some things are good with upgrades, some things aren't, but all in all, it's a new opportunity for you to re-identify who you are, and I hope that you'll keep listening and learn more from the next episode of ABCs of Concussion here on AM 950 Radio.